recommend?
Outside of KGNU, you mean? I don't want to sound dismissive, but I really think it's the wrong question. Nothing is unbiased. Everything is presented from a certain point of view. If you're honest, you make your point of view clear. If you're dishonest, you pretend you're objective, and so on and so forth. And then it's really up to you to decide what you think is telling something that sounds reasonable to you. And you really ought to be triangulating. You look at different things and see how the world looks from different points of view, and then you make your own decisions. It's just as if you're you're a chemist working on some problem in chemistry. There is nothing that gives you an unbiased point of view. It takes work, and it's a lot harder when you are trying to deal with human affairs. So, I know what I think is important, but it's really up to you to decide what you think is important. For example, I learn a lot by reading the Wall Street Journal. That's why I was quoting it. I can't stand what, we disagree on every imaginable topic. But if you read it, you can learn a lot about, first of all, what's happening, because they have pretty honest reporting. Remember, they're reporting for the business world, which has to have a semi-realistic picture of what the world is like. And you also learn what's being thought about in centers of power. That's important. I don't say that's the only thing you should read. I think you should read Z Magazine too, but from then on you've got to decide yourself.
I'm next.
You're next?
Yeah.
Okay, I lost track.
And I'm not going to miss this opportunity. I've been waiting for a long time. You mentioned that the next region that it's going to be in the eyes of the United States...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
You mentioned that the next region could be the Andean region. That's the United States is going to go propagate the democracy and freedoms that we
like we've done in Latin America for a century. Yeah.
I would like you to give us Bolivia in the last 5 years, and I'm a Bolivian. I was born in Bolivia, but I'm a U.S. citizen now. Bolivia in the last 5 years has discovered quite a bit of natural gas, and it's probably that in the next 5 years we will get close to the U.S. and reserves in the American continent. And there's quite a bit of opposition about a project that has been taking place. The government is trying to implement a project that is called Pacific LNG, liquefying Bolivian natural gas and exporting it to Southern California. There's quite a bit of opposition about that project from local people because it doesn't it's not going to benefit Bolivia in any way. If you know anything about that, if you could give us a little bit more details. Mm-hmm. And also I have a request from a lot of civic and organizations in Bolivia to invite you down there to give us an idea about the devastating consequences of the American free trade that the U.S. government is trying to propagate all over South America.
Mm-hmm. Well, you probably know more about Bolivian resources than I do, so I won't answer, but I doubt that the resources are on that scale. I think they're significant, but I doubt that they're on the North American scale. However, it is true that there are intelligence projections. A document you ought to read, it's public, is called, forget the name, Global... It's in the year 2000, the National Intelligence Community, that's the CIA and the rest of them, published a projection for the next 15 years. If you want a reference to it, send me an email. It's got a website. Or you can get it under the CIA website if you look. And it's a long, detailed projection of what they expect in the next 15 years, and it's pretty interesting. Parts of it have to do with this. They describe the Andean region. They don't mention Bolivia, well, except that insofar as it's part of this region at the periphery. But the Andean region, they say they expect to be one of the main sources on which the U.S. will rely for its energy requirements. Not the only one, but one. That's why I mentioned that it's a possible target, aside from the fact that it's out of control. Bolivia, as you know, is almost out of control. Came very close to electing a populist president. They would have if it hadn't been for violence. There's a lot of opposition in Bolivia to the so-called drug war, which doesn't have a lot to do with drugs, but it has a lot to do with driving people off the land and things like that. And it's been a disaster in Bolivia for the population for almost 20 years now. Alternative development programs that have been talked about haven't been realized, as they haven't been anywhere else, and it's pretty bad news. And a lot of tension and violence. The U.S., as I mentioned, has military bases all over the region, and undoubtedly is looking for, there are plans to go further, including Bolivia. As to the free trade agreements, well, there's one region where they've been implemented. North America, okay, Canada, United States, and Mexico, and that's NAFTA. It's opposed by the populations in all three countries. It was implemented over the objections of the populations of all three countries. It's one of Clinton's other achievements. It required a tremendous media campaign to prevent people from knowing about what was happening. I mean, to this day, 10 years later, the official position of the labor movement has not been allowed expression. Right? A lot of denunciation of the labor movement, but their own position, which was pretty reasonable, wasn't allowed expression, still isn't. The population is still opposed. Back in at the Hemispheric Summit in, April 2001 in Quebec, that was supposed to be the summit that was going to establish the free trade agreement for the Americas. Okay, and and NAFTA was the model. Everyone read the headlines. It's all about how magnificent NAFTA was. Now we have to extend the benefits to the hemisphere. Well, here's another propaganda achievement for you. The two major organizations, pretty well-known organizations, the leading human rights group in the world, Human Rights Watch, and the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, which is one of the major think tanks that does regular economic analysis. Both of them published major documents on NAFTA timed for release at the summit. Human Rights Watch their document dealt with effects of NAFTA on labor rights in the three countries. The Economic Policy Institute document had experts from the three countries discussing in detail the effects on working people of NAFTA in the three countries. Had a friend do a database search on that. It wasn't mentioned in the United States, except for one op-ed in a small town newspaper. Well, why? Because Human Rights Watch concluded that NAFTA had been harmful to labor rights in all three countries, mostly Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And the Economic Policy Institute gave a detailed analysis in which they concluded that it's one of those rare agreements which had been harmful to working people, which means the majority of the population in all three countries. Most harmful in Mexico, which is the most vulnerable. And you don't want people to know that when the headlines are talking about how marvelous NAFTA is and how we have to extend it to the hemisphere. But if you read those reports, you get a pretty good assessment of what the effect of so-called free trade is. And it's not free trade. That's propaganda. It's a very special form of international integration which gives rights to investors, not to people. So under, say, NAFTA, one of the provisions of NAFTA, like the World Trade Organization, is that corporations are permitted to claim national rights. So GM can go to Mexico and claim the rights of Mexican businesses. What happens if a Mexican of flesh and blood that tries to go to New York and claim the rights of an American person of flesh and blood? Don't have to bother asking. That's just only one example of special rights that are given to private tyrannies that people don't have. When NAFTA was passed, it was implemented in 1994, there was another legislation implemented in 1994 by the Clinton administration. It was called Operation Gatekeeper. It militarized the U.S.-Mexican border. That's an artificial border, like most borders. It was established by conquest. The United States conquered half of Mexico. And the border has been pretty porous in both directions. Same people live on both sides. They've been moving up and back. Clinton understood that when NAFTA is passed, you have to block the movement of people. Okay? Free trade, if you go back to Adam Smith, is based on free movement of people. But you have to stop that. And the reason is because they anticipated an economic disaster in Mexico that they were going to call an economic miracle. And it was going to mean there would be a flood of people from Mexico fleeing to the United States. And you got to block that, so they militarized the border. And hundreds of Mexicans have been killed since then trying to cross the border. It's one of the effects of NAFTA. These are not free trade agreements. They're agreements which provide, which are carefully calibrated to be a mixture of protectionism and liberalization, designed for the interests of those who are designing them. That's not very surprising. The people who are designing them, mainly corporate sector, are designing them in their interest. It includes very highly protectionist measures and the kind of liberalization that will benefit them. But they're not free trade agreements, and NAFTA, at least, appears to have been harmful to the majority of the population in all three countries. There's no particular reason to think that if you extend it to the hemisphere, it's going to be any different.
Before I leave, I have to convey the message of some of the people that wanted to invite you there. And I know you're booked for the next 2 years or 3 years, but can I contact you somehow, and maybe we can discuss if you could do something, because they want to have you there, and they want to listen. In
Bolivia?
In Bolivia.
Yeah, I have one of my many thick files of invitations is from friends in Bolivia.
How can I contact you?
You can just email me, but all I can do is add it to the file.
Okay, where do I get your email on the web?
It's the obvious one. Just my name, Chomsky, at MIT.edu, educational institutions. So just what you'd guess.
Thank you. I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay.
What's to prevent...
But I have to tell you that I'll probably have to send a form response. I mean, I get hundreds a day, and even spending 4 or 5 hours a night, I can't really respond.
We'll keep at it.
But so a lot of them have to say, if it's an invitation, just all I can do is file it.
What's to prevent Mr. Bush from carrying out a plan, which I believe is part of his national emergency policy, and that is to cancel the 2004 elections?
I think, these guys are pretty bad, but I don't think that's in the cards. I think that probably would lead to a rebellion in the country. Unless, with an exception, if some major terrorist action takes place, all bets are off. And I don't say that they're trying to stimulate one, but the policies that they are pursuing are increasing the likelihood of terrorist operations, and they know it. They read their own intelligence reports. They read CIA reports. They read what strategic analysts are saying. And they're almost uniform in saying that the policies that are being pursued are likely to increase the threat of terrorism. And the threat is severe. You want to know how severe it is? I recommend some reading. There's a high-level task force, Hart-Rudman task force, organized by the Council on Foreign Relations, which just came out with its report a couple of months ago on some title like Terrorist Threats to the United States. Like everyone else, they said the threats are going to be increased by the attack on Iraq. Everybody says that. But the threat, then they run through it's kind of like a cookbook for terrorists. It has a series of threats which I hadn't even thought of, and they're very extreme. So, for example, they point out, and they apparently unstoppable. I forget the numbers, but they point out that a huge number of containers, most of what comes into the country is in containers, container ships. I think it's tens of millions a year, some extremely high number. And those containers are uninspected. Okay, anything could be in them. Furthermore, there's no way to inspect them. They come from 3 or 4 places around the world, Singapore, Amsterdam, or maybe Rotterdam, and some other place. And if you tried to inspect them, you would back up commerce, for months. trucks clogging all of Europe, waiting to be inspected. I mean, the whole economic system would collapse.